I want to talk today about fear. I don't want to talk about the kind of fear that you have when you watch a horror movie. I don't want to talk about the kind of fear that makes you check your front door twice before you go to bed to make sure it's locked. That's not the kind of fear I'm talking about. The fear I want to talk about is the deepest fear that we experience in this life. The kind of fear that seems to come on and hit us in a moment's notice when the doctor comes back through the door and says, "I'm sorry, we found something." Or when the phone rings at 2 a.m., and we all know a 2 a.m. phone call is usually never good. That kind of fear. I've been gripped by fear, even in the last few days. I know what it's like to have fear invade itself into your life, for your kneecaps to dance, for the words of reason from others around you to seemingly be muffled, and for you to not see anything but white. That kind of horrible fear is the fear that grips our hearts. When circumstances are spinning out of control, when hope seems to fade, when desperation takes over, it's that kind of fear. And today, we're going to look at two people who faced that kind of fear, that kind of moment in their life that are woven together in the tapestry of the Gospel of Mark. Two people who had to discover what I am going to call fearless faith. I've entitled my message, Fearless Faith, Trusting Jesus in Life's Most Hopeless Moments. Listen, I want you to know this right off the bat, that a disciple of Jesus Christ must exhibit faith that is both fearless and active. Both things. We must have faith that is fearless and active, trusting Jesus even in life's most desperate circumstances. That's what I want to explore today. So open up your Bibles with me to Mark chapter 5. We're going to look at Mark chapter 5, verse 21, and I audaciously am hopeful to get all the way through verse 6 of chapter 6. You can follow along in the Bibles in front of you on page 840. I want us to continue our series entitled Unveiled as we see Jesus removing the veil off of the eyes of those in front of him, the veil off of our eyes to see who he truly is. Our story here in Mark chapter 5, verse 21 begins with a man named Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue, a ruler of the Jews. It wasn't just any person. It was someone who had standing and reputation, respect in the community. Yet we're going to find him doing something that would have been absolutely shocking to Jews and Gentiles who were standing there in the presence of Christ. Look at verse 21 through 24 with me of Mark 5. It says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hand on her so that she may be well and live.' And he went with him." Picture this. A religious leader shows up and falls down on his knees publicly, begging at the feet of Christ. What could have driven a man to such desperation? Verse 23 tells us, "My little daughter is at the point of death." Any parent here knows exactly what Jairus was feeling in that moment. I'll never forget when my little baby boy, Patton, was so sick in the hospital and had to be intubated, and we're laying his flimsy body on the bed and allowing the doctors to take over. And I remember thinking in that moment, I am so desperate for somebody to fix this. I am so desperate for anyone to come in with a solution. That's what Jairus felt. When your child suffers, you'll do anything to help them. You'll set aside your pride, your position. You'll set aside all protocol, anything just to see them well again. That's what this religious leader, Jairus, is doing. He demonstrates for us, I think, that something we should take note of. He demonstrates what I'm going to call the starting point of faith. That is, that we must recognize our complete desperation. Here he is, absolutely desperate for a power greater than his to save his daughter. If we're going to have fearless faith, then we must recognize that fearless faith is founded on Jesus' power. He's powerless. Jairus is powerless. He needs Jesus' power. So he goes to Jesus and asks him, please do something for my daughter. Jesus follows Jairus towards his home, but as they're walking, we get a beautiful interruption, once again to show us just how powerful Jesus is. Now, Mark, the author of this book, is doing something fascinating here. He's taking a narrative and he's putting it inside of another narrative. It's like a picture inside of a picture, a window in a window, or some would say a Markian sandwich. Maybe a hamburger is a better illustration. There's the top bun and the bottom bun, the one story that we're following around Jairus. But within those two ends, which we will come back to the story of Jairus by the end, within those two ends, there is a whole other story taking place. Mark's doing something here. He's showing us something. In the middle of an urgent journey to save a dying girl, we meet another woman, a woman bleeding for 12 years. Look at the end of verse 24 through 26. It says, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. Let me help you understand what's happening to this woman bleeding for 12 years. This is a gynecology problem. She's having a menstrual period that's lasting 12 years. She's bleeding without stopping. According to Levitical law, her condition would have made her ceremonially unclean. Think of this, 12 years. For 12 years, she cannot worship Yahweh with the others who worship him. For 12 years, anyone who would touch her would be unclean and then have to go through a re-cleansing process. For 12 years, she lived in absolute isolation. She had shame all over her. She increased in her poverty because she gave everything she had to try to solve the problem. You see it there in verse 26. Having suffered much under many physicians and had spent all she had and was no better, rather grew worse. Dr. Paul Brand was a man who lived from 1914 to 2003. He was a pioneer missionary surgeon. He devoted much of his life to treating people with leprosy. He was in India helping patients regain nerves that would allow them to go forward and keep limbs or appendages. He was raised by missionary parents in South India. Brand became world-renowned specifically for his hand surgery that he would do to work on the nerve damage that was related to leprosy. His work revolutionized the study of the disease of leprosy, and people would come from all over the place to seek his help. In fact, one woman is told to even have had sold everything she owned to make a journey hundreds of miles to reach his clinic. She exhausted every possible remedy, local doctors, traditional medicine, spiritual rituals, all of it, to seek Brand's help. It reminds me of the lady in Mark 5. She suffered for many years trying everything to find healing. Bleeding for 12 years, taking much suffering, much or many doctors, all she had, and yet none of it could heal her. She was desperate. She was unclean, yet had faith that if she could just touch Jesus' garment, it would bring healing to her. Like Brand's patients, she had nowhere else to turn, but her desperation drove her to find healing in Jesus. Look at what happens out of desperation in verse 27 through 34. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garment, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up. And she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And the disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing all around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. The woman made her move. She cut through the crowd, sneaking past everyone's legs, not, of course, approaching Jesus from the front, but coming behind him because she's unclean. She didn't dare to ask for his help publicly because she's so ashamed. So instead, she slips through the crowd behind him and thinks, if I just touch his garment, I will be made well. She exhibits the second element that I would capture in this text as an element of fearless faith. The first is desperation. The second is taking bold initiative based on what you believe Jesus to be. She takes bold initiative to come behind him. Verse 27. Now, I find it interesting that this is the only place where Mark uses this phrase behind him outside of the call of Christ to the disciples to come and follow him. The phrase that he used when calling his disciples was, come follow me, come be behind me. So now we have a picture of what could be a model disciple who comes behind Christ in great faith, trusting that he will unveil all that he is. And the moment she touches his garment, she's healed. Immediately, the blood stopped. Something unbelievable happens in her life, and something somewhat comical happens in the story. She touches him. Immediately the bleeding stops, and Jesus stops and says, who touched me? You have to smile at this. We're told prior to this that the people are thronging about him. They're all around him, that they're on every side of him. I love the disciples' response in verse 31. They say, you do see that the crowd is pressing all around you, and yet you say, who touched you? I mean, you can almost hear their exasperation in the moment. Like, really, Jesus? Like, this is crazy. Like, we're all here. Like, we all touched you. Like, we're all touching each other. That's just how it's going. And you're going to ask the question, who touched me? Like, this isn't good for publicity's sake. Like, could you not ask crazy questions and start acting odd? They say to him, what do you mean, who touched you? Everyone is touching you. Why would this small piece of the story be captured for us? I think Jesus is unveiling his power and his authority once again in the Gospel of Mark. As we see in a moment, Jesus is, through his touch, going to give his power to Jairus' daughter to heal her. At that moment, again, there will be some kind of snickering or laughing. Verse 40, they laugh at him when he touches them. There's laughter when they're in the crowd. There's laughter in the house when the daughter's being healed. What's happening here? I think they're missing the display of power that Jesus is trying to give them. And we must not miss the fact that touch seems to be so emphasized by this gospel writer. She touched the hem of his garment, no doubt to only have him turn around and touch her and rise her up and have her experience this full healing and be shown as totally clean, no longer unclean in front of everyone who was there. And yet in the same way, verse 41, he's going to touch Jairus' daughter and have her stand to her feet. This touching was important. Jesus knew the difference between a casual brush in a crowd, that was happening all around him, and the touch of desperate faith. He knew the difference. He felt the power go out of him. Scientists at Vanderbilt University Medical Center have documented a remarkable healing power in human touch. There's been groundbreaking research studies that have found that when a premature infant in the NICU receives gentle, intentional touching through skin-to-skin contact, which they will call kangaroo care, this kind of care actually helps accelerate the baby's neurological healing or development. Dr. Natalie Madar, who led the research, discovered that babies who experienced supportive touch showed stronger brain responses compared to those who did not experience touch. In fact, these infants developed more normal responses when they were gently touched and had better cognitive and language outcomes later in their life. And when the painful things came in their life, while they still would experience pain, the pain was lessened if they had intentional healing touch from parents or caretakers. That's amazing. The physical contact literally rewires the developing brain of infants, transforming their response to the world around them. Human touch not only can reduce hormones like cortisol, increasing bonding hormones like oxytocin, it fundamentally changes us at a neurological level. Touch. Touch has a genuine, measurable healing property. That's just human-to-human touch. But what this woman experienced, what Jairus' daughter is about to experience, is infinitely more powerful than even the most healing human touch. She touches his garment with faith, and divine power flows out of him. The very energy of creation himself now flows through the very one who created all things into her broken body, instantly restoring what was broken and bleeding for 12 years. Not to mention the isolation that she experienced, all the medical treatments that she had tried, but they failed. If human touch can rewire a small baby's brain, imagine what happens when we reach out and touch Jesus Christ. This woman comes forward in fear and trembling. Don't mistake that. She realizes what just happened. In fear and trembling, she falls down before Jesus and she tells him the whole truth. And Jesus' response is beautiful. It's one of my favorite in the whole Gospel of Mark. He looks at her and he calls her daughter. Did you know that nowhere else in the entire Gospel does he ever call someone daughter? He might refer to them as his children or God's children or child of God, but this is the only moment where he now looks at this woman who probably had been abandoned by her own family, didn't even know what it meant to have a loving father. And now Christ looks at her in the most personal and enduring way and says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Fearless faith is powerful because Jesus is powerful. Our faith is in Jesus. Jesus is powerful, and his power flows to those who approach him in faith. Now, don't miss the picture within the picture of what's happening here. As this woman is now speaking with Jesus, this man, Jairus, is waiting. Come on, we got to get to my daughter. It's happening at the same exact time. And then someone from Jairus' house shows up with devastating news and says, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" Verse 35 of Mark 5 says, "While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, 'Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?' But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, 'Do not fear, only believe.' And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James." Can you put yourself in Jairus' shoes for a moment? He took the step of faith to come to Jesus in desperate hope, to fall down at his feet, to beg him to, "Please, will you come to my daughter?" And then he has to, on the way, experience a setback of Jesus pausing to help someone else while his daughter's life is hanging in the balance. I can't believe this is happening. We have to hurry. I don't know how much longer we have. Why are you talking to this woman? Everyone's touching you. Come on, we got to go. And then the news comes, it's too late. It's at that moment Jairus learns an important lesson, I think, for all of us, and that is that fearless faith persists through apparent defeat. It's too late. Apparently, the story's over. But not for fearless faith and not for Jesus. I mean, how many times have we experienced the same kind of devastating disappointment? We get to this place where we think it's over. We might even pray things or say things like, if only God would have moved faster. Or if only he had answered my prayers sooner. Or if only he hadn't seemed to prioritize someone else over my issue. But notice Jesus' immediate response. He overhears what they're saying to Jairus. And in verse 36, he says, do not fear, only believe. An unbelievable moment. He just heals this woman. I imagine that he stood her up. She's telling the whole truth, the whole story. Jesus hears what they're saying to Jairus. He looks at Jairus, he looks back at the woman. He looks at Jairus, he looks back at the woman. He looks at Jairus, he looks back at the woman. And he looks at Jairus and he says, do not fear. Only believe. Only believe. As if the miracle that had just happened proved the impossible. So Jairus, keep your eyes on me. Only believe. Before Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile in 1954, medical experts insisted that it was physically impossible for a human to run a 4-minute mile. They said the human heart would explode. They said that the lungs on a human body couldn't process oxygen quickly enough. So for 9 years, the world record had stood at 4 minutes and 1.4 seconds. Painfully close, but seemingly unbreakable. On May 6, 1954, on a windy day at Oxford University, Bannister did what experts said couldn't be done. He ran a mile in less than 4 minutes. 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds to be exact. He collapsed at the finish line, completely spent. And when he was asked about it later, he said it was a moment when time stood still. Here's what's most remarkable about the story. Within just 46 days, Australian John Landy broke Bannister's record. I mean, that's just a bummer, let's be honest. He only got to have it for 46 days. Like, come on, that's sad. Within 3 years, 16 other runners broke the 4-minute barrier. And today, high school athletes regularly accomplish what was once deemed medically impossible. What changed? Not human physiology, not the human body. What changed? The mental barrier was broken. What was once thought to be impossible was now achievable because someone dared to believe differently. So in the same way, Jesus is now telling Jairus, don't listen to the voices that it's impossible. Don't accept it's too late as the final verdict. Only believe. Only believe. Fearless faith persists when apparent defeat says it's over. Look at verse 38. They go on to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside. He took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. When they arrive at the house, the professional mourners, the crybabies, the ones invited to wail and weep are there. Jesus says to them, this child is not dead, it's sleeping. And what do? They laugh at him. Their laughter, I think, reveals something profound about unbelief. Unbelief cannot recognize possibilities beyond our own limited experience. For them, there was no pulse. There was no oxygen in the lungs. She's dead. So you say she's sleeping. You obviously don't get it. And all they're going off of is their limited experience. So what does Jesus do? He puts them outside. You out. He creates space where faith, not cynicism, not criticism, where faith will determine what happens next. With only the parents inside, with only James and John and Peter, with only these few people, he says to the girl, Talitha cumi, little girl, I say to you, arise. Now, if I was writing the script, I probably would have gone a whole nother way. I probably would have been like, all right, let's get an arena. Let's go ahead and bring her body in the middle of the arena. Let's fill it. Let's make sure as many people are here to see this as possible, because this is about to be amazing. But that wasn't how Jesus chose to work. He put out the skeptics. He put out the doubters. He kept only 5 people inside to see this little girl come back to life. And in that moment, fearless faith met divine power. The dad and mom weeping, hoping, please do something. You said sleeping? She's only sleeping. Show us she's only sleeping. And here in this moment, this fearless faith starts to grow and collides with Christ's divine power. And at that very moment, death cowers. Stop, he says to death. Come no further. Divine power takes over. This fearless faith created space for Jesus to work miraculously beyond human expectations or possibilities. Notice what happens next. Verse 42 says, immediately the girl got up and began to walk. I love that. But then there's this seemingly insignificant detail that's added in a parenthetical statement between 2 parentheses. It says, for she was 12 years old. 12 years. The exact length of time that the woman had been bleeding. Mark is connecting these stories deliberately. You have to wonder at that moment, as Jairus' daughter comes and sits up, 12-year-old daughter sits up, you have to wonder, did Jesus look Jairus in the eyes and say, remember back in the crowd where the woman told the whole truth? And she mentioned that she'd been bleeding for 12 years? That suffering started the day your daughter was born, or right around it. And for 12 years, this moment, this miracle has been in absolute preparation. One daughter suffered for 12 years. Remember, he referred to her as a daughter. One daughter dies at 12 years old. But in both of these instances, he brings life. One daughter has a caring earthly father. One daughter seemingly has no one caring for her. Yet in all of this, Christ shows his supremacy and his power. over what seemed final and hopeless. In both cases, faith was the conduit through which power flowed. But notice a striking contrast in the next section. Jesus returns to his hometown, and instead of them welcoming him with faith, his neighbors respond with skepticism. What? Verse 1 through 6 of Mark 6. And he went away from there, and he came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his own town and among his relatives and his own household." And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about among the villages teaching. Is not this Joseph and Mary's son? They can't look beyond what is familiar to them. And Mark reports this shocking statement in verse 5. And he could do no mighty work there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. Unbelief limits our experience of God's power. We should be astounded by this. There are only two things that amazed Christ in the Gospels: faith or lack of faith. This is one of the instances where we see lack of faith amazing Christ. It didn't just amaze him. The unbelief limited the experience of God's power for these people. Jesus had just raised a girl from the dead. He had just healed another woman, and now he's in this town. And notice, in his hometown, he could do no mighty work. Verse 6 is why. Because he marveled at their unbelief. There's a principle in that for us, that unbelief creates a barrier that limits our experience of Jesus' power. You live in a state of unbelief, you are limiting your experience of Jesus' power. Now, let me be very clear. Jesus can do whatever Jesus wants to do. We don't take away his power. But you need to notice something in the text that's captured in the original language as well. It doesn't say Jesus wouldn't do mighty works. It says that he couldn't do mighty works. In other words, their unbelief was so powerful that it constrained what the Son of God could accomplish among them. Now again, he's sovereign. If he wanted to break through it, he could. But what the point of the author is here is that their unbelief kept him from doing the very thing he came to do. And it reveals something profound to us about how God works. He has designed a world where our faith, or our lack of faith for that matter, somehow influences how we experience him. Specifically, our lack of faith has consequences. When there is unbelief, there are real consequences that have to be dealt with. John Flavel, one of my favorite writers, powerfully wrote, "Unbelief is the greatest sin, being the root of all sins. It was Adam's first sin, the sin that does not honor God." But he goes on to say, faith brings most glory to God. Therefore, on the contrast, unbelief brings most dishonor to God. My friends, unbelief is the soul's deepest darkness. Unbelief shuts out the promises of God in our life. It builds a wall between our emptiness and Christ's fullness, between our weakness and Christ's strength. So tear down your walls of unbelief. for they're limiting the very power of God you can experience in your life. It's not because God lacks power. That's not what I'm saying. But faith is the vessel by which he chooses to pour out his power. So unleash your faith. What does fearless faith look like? How do we develop fearless faith? I'm going to collect the principles that I've shared with you from this text and give them here to you as a gift as we get ready to go. How do we develop fearless faith? I think there are 5 key principles when I look at these stories. First, we must acknowledge our desperate need for Jesus. Like Jairus, he did whatever he could to get to Jesus, to fall at his feet. The bleeding woman made her way through the crowd to get to Jesus' feet. Maybe you and I need to admit that we have exhausted all human solutions in that problem or nuisance in our life, and it's time to confess our desperation for Christ. As long as we believe we can solve our problem on our own, I'm telling you, we will not experience the life-changing power that Christ is offering us. Why is it that we so often turn to Jesus as a last resort? It's crazy. It's maddening to me. We turn to everything else first, money and doctors and success and relationships, before we seek Jesus, the true ruler, the true healer. She had much suffering. She had seen many doctors. She sold all that she had. We do the same thing. Why wait till we're desperate to come to him? Fearless faith acknowledges our desperation. Fearless faith takes bold initiative in faith. Listen, doesn't wait passively for God to act. Faith reaches out even when circumstances or other people, society tell us that we shouldn't. The bleeding woman, she pushed through the crowd, desperate. Despite her unclean status, she risked to touch Jesus. Jairus, in the same way, risked his reputation by publicly seeking Jesus. Bold faith takes risks. That's what it does. We also develop fearless faith by rejecting voices of doubt. When the messengers told Jairus, "Your daughter is dead, why trouble the teacher any further?" Jesus immediately counters, "Do not fear, only believe." Yet how easy it would have been in the commotion of the crowd for him to receive this message and say, "It's too late," and start walking away. How easy would it be for you in your life to let voices of doubt overwhelm you? I'm going to be honest with you. I have a choir of people that like to sing doubt in my life. And guess who the lead vocalist is? Me. I'm constantly singing doubt into my life. It's not true. It's all over for you. It's not too late. It's not too late. The voices of doubt will always be present in your life, from someone else or you to your own heart. But listen, choose Jesus' words. Do not be afraid. Only believe. And don't accept the voices that tell you it's too late. Fourth, we develop this unbelievable fear, unbelievable faith, so that we can be fearless by moving beyond what is familiar. The people in Jesus' hometown couldn't receive Jesus because they thought they already knew who he was. Follow me on this. Some of you have been journeying with Jesus for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 decades. You think you already know who Jesus is. But my friend, I've been with Jesus for over 3 decades, and I know that I only know a thimble size of who Jesus is. And he's going to reveal to me for the rest of eternity the glory that he is, that is as big as the oceans. He will pour into me all that he is. So if I think for a moment that I somehow have figured him out, grown so familiar with him. Well, this is what he's always done. This is what he's going to do. Then I have categorized and limited him by my past experience. True faith doesn't do that. Fearless faith sees Jesus as he truly is, not as you assume him to be. And finally, fearless faith creates space for wonder. Notice that Jesus puts all the mourners outside of the house before raising the girl. He creates an environment where faith can flourish. In the same way, we must be good at creating environments, moments in our life, times with other people in church community who will help us see Jesus and his mighty works. How often do we push out through our busy schedules, our life that is cluttered, the opportunity for wonder? Some of you just need to go turn off your phones. Some of you need to go for a walk. And you need to say, Jesus, show me your wonder. Show me your awe. Give me awe again. Let me sing from the bottom of my heart that you're awesome and that you will do something in my fearful moments that I could never imagine. Turn my worry into worship. You need to create some space for wonder, for faith to grow. Have you ever watched a flying trapeze artist at a circus? There's this breathtaking moment in their performance that perfectly captures what faith looks like. The flyer is swinging high above the ground. He or she's building momentum. And then at precisely the right moment, she must release her grip completely. It's that heart-stopping second where she's suspended in midair. There's no safety net below, no bar in her hands, nothing but empty space all around her. It's that moment where she's completely vulnerable. It's that moment where she has committed herself fully to the belief that her partner will catch her. She probably can't see things clearly because she's spinning. Her vision is blurred by the motion and the distance. She can't reach out and grab onto anything, not yet. He's still beyond her grasp. All she can do is trust. Trust that the hand that has caught her before will catch her again. Trust in perfect timing. Trust what she cannot see. Trust what she cannot feel. That is fearless faith. And that's exactly what Jesus asks Jairus when he says, "Do not fear, only believe." He's asking Jairus, let go of everything tangible, everything that seems certain, and trust the unseen hand of God, that it will be there to catch you in your moments of greatest vulnerability. My friends, I think Jesus' word comes to us today and says, do not fear, only believe. In your 12 years, maybe it's 24 years, maybe it's months and months on end, whatever it is, in your years of suffering, I'm asking, friend, would you reach out and would you touch Christ? Or maybe even more importantly, would you notice where he's touching you? Would you notice where he's bringing to life what is dead? When you receive devastating news, Jesus says to you, only believe. And friend, in your familiar spaces, or maybe you've been with Christ many times before, realize that Jesus waits to reveal his extraordinary power to you once again. Whatever seems hopeless in your situation today, Jesus is inviting you to approach him with fearless faith, a faith that acknowledges desperation, a faith that takes bold initiative, a faith that rejects voices of doubt, a faith that moves beyond familiarity, and a faith that creates space for wonder. Will you accept Christ's invitation into this kind of faith? Will you reach out and touch him today? Will you only believe? Heavenly Father, we thank you for your love and your grace. We thank you that you are faithful even when we are faithless. And God, I pray that you will help us continue to be people dependent upon your Savior through the power of your Spirit, acknowledging the providence and the presence of God our Father. Lord, will you help us, please, be people that have fearless faith. We love you. In the name of Christ we pray. And all God's people said, amen.